Gerald crouched low as he prepared to make a break for it. He watched the two forms as they stumbled about the 3-bedroom trailer, their movements angry and jerky. They were drunk again. They were drunk every night, and Gerald could see that if they caught him, there were several scenarios that would cause this to be his last escape attempt. He saw 4 potential paths before him, but only 2 were routes that wouldn't lead to his death. The 2 paths were black strings, paths that would lead to a bottle upside his head or an accidental shooting. The third was a red string, danger, but a chance for escape. The fourth was a blue string, the familiar blue string that led to his future. Gerald tensed as he crouched between 2 bushes in his side yard, the backpack held tight against him as he watched that blue string. It was going over the side yard fence, out towards the road, and if he could get out of the yard and on the path, he'd be home free. He'd thought as much before, but he had a good feeling about tonight, and he thought this might be the successful run that got him out of his abusive little family situation. He had taken his first step, his trainers peeking from the bush, when he stopped dead in his tracks. The blue string was suddenly twinged with orange, and as he watched, the orange became red as the fibers filled in the blue. Crap. That meant danger. The back door was flung open suddenly, and his father stumbled out of their trailer and looked at the yard from the back porch. "Gerald! Where the hell are you, boy? I know you're out here, Gerald. You better get your ass back over here right now." Gerald was still as a statue. Had they checked his bed already? They couldn't have found the trap door that he made in the corner of the closet, or they'd be a lot madder than they already were. Clearly his dummy hadn't fooled them, and now he had been discovered. They didn't know where he was, but they suspected that he was close, and they meant to find him before he could escape. He looked back at the blue string, and sure enough, it had gone from blue to red, and was now slowly becoming black to match the other 3. If he went forward with this plan, he would surely die. The only way open to him was back the way he had come, the cord still a pulsating red, back into danger. But danger beat death every time. His dad was going back inside, and Gerald had made his move as the door closed. The trailer skirting came up easily, the victim of so many other botched escape attempts, and he was under the trailer and heading for his room with practiced ease. He peeked through the hole that he had made, the rug he had laid over it bulging as he checked his room, and found it to be empty. He left his backpack under the house and came up into his bedroom just as he heard his dad's heavy footsteps in the hallway. Gerald gritted his teeth. The old man was faster than he expected, and as Gerald made his slow way towards the bed, he was certain that his father would throw the door open and freeze him like a bug in the hallway light. He was nearly there, 3 easy steps, when he heard the clatter of the knob as his dad's meaty paw gripped it roughly. "Better be in that bed, you little shit!" Gerald tensed, seeing the black string that was forming between himself and the door, and knowing this beating would be his last. "Leave him alone, you brute," came a slurry voice from the living room. "He's probably just asleep. Let him sleep before you wake up the whole damn trailer park yelling like that." The doorknob stilled, and Gerald didn't look the gift horse in the mouth. He'd slid beneath the covers as his father's angry steps went up the hall, yelling at his mother to shut the hell up, and how he would discipline his boy any way he saw fit, and how... But Gerald shut his eyes as he shut out the yelling and shrieking, the sound of flesh on flesh as his dad slapped her or beat her or any number of other things. Gerald closed his eyes and scrunched down beneath the covers, praying it would all just end and he could fall into the mattress and be nothing but an afterthought. His dad didn't come back that night, and Gerald drifted off to the thought that at least he could try again tomorrow. The joy that thought brought him was not something that should bring solace to a 10-year-old, but Gerald wasn't a normal boy, after all. Gerald could see the strings, and the strings helped him stay one step ahead of his dad, his mom, and anyone else who might want to hurt him. Gerald had been able to see the strings for as long as he could remember. They were different colors, and he figured out pretty quick what they meant. Red was danger, orange was caution, yellow meant someone would likely be his friend, pink meant someone loved him, green meant he was being led towards money or other things, black meant certain death, and he had only just realized it in time the first time. Then there was blue. Blue was like the guiding marks in video games. Blue led him towards his destiny. At least, that's what he believed. Whenever a blue string led him to a person, they were always an important part of his life. It had led him to Kevin, his best friend. It had led him to Mr. Turner, the teacher who had gotten him through the 2nd grade and had helped him right up until his dad took him out of school. It led him to Lou, the janitor who had protected him from Hank, his bully. It had led him to Mrs. Castleberry, the teacher who had tried to help him escape his abusive father, right up until they had removed him from school. The blue string helped him grow closer to his goal, and Gerald was curious where it would lead him next. Away from this crumbling meth trailer, he hoped. It hadn't always been this bad, of course. When his dad had been working at the disposal plant, he'd been a nice, normal guy. He worked from 6 till 2 every day, had weekends off, and he'd been using a little bit of the meth to keep up with the younger guys at work. He had it under control, and his drinking wasn't so bad. He got a little drunk sometimes, but Gerald remembered his dad as a happy drunk who was the life of the party at cookouts and family gatherings. His mom had always been the rock at home, keeping everything together so that Gerald had a nice, soft place to land when he came home from school. They were living in a rental trailer owned by a guy who sold his dad drugs. That was true, but they were saving up for a house outside the trailer court, and soon, his dad had promised, they would have a nice new house with a big backyard and some things to play on and maybe even a puppy. Those days made Gerald smile when he remembered them, until he remembered that they had been a lie. Well, not a lie. Not really. More like a dream that remained unrealized, and likely would never be. It all started when his dad got hurt at work. "Please, Milton, I'm sorry." His mother's cries of pain woke him up, and Gerald realized he had only dozed off for a few minutes. He could hear the sound of his father's hand as he took his poor wife to task, slapping her again and again as she cried out pitifully. He was slurring something at her, his speech unintelligible between the drugs and the booze. She was gibbering wetly, and Gerald thought that he might be about to kill her like he intended to kill Gerald. "There, now look what you made me do. You think I like hitting you? Do you? Do you?" Whether he did or not, he hit her again for good measure, and then all was quiet beyond the low sobbing of his mother. She'd been part of the reason he hadn't left yet. Part, but not all. There was a naive part of Gerald that hoped that maybe things could turn around. Maybe they could be that happy family again. Maybe things could go back to what they were, and they could leave this depressing little place and return to the daydream of their brick house with the backyard and the puppy. It was a good dream, but it was never going to happen. It had all started with a bad fall. It had been raining when Dad fell. The rain had made the step where he put his foot slippery. The truck he had been riding on the back of had taken a bump a little too hard. His dad had been tired from lugging cans in the rain all day, and his grip hadn't been as good as it could be. Regardless of the reason, his father had slipped off the back of the truck and hurt his back. It hadn't been a bad injury. His father had healed up in a matter of weeks. The problem was that they had drug tested him, and when they found drugs in his system, they fired him. They assumed the drugs were the reason that he had fallen off the truck. They assumed that he had been wired on meth and gotten hurt. They assumed he wasn't being careful, and they let him go. They made a lot of assumptions, but all of them led to his dad being fired. That had led to his landlord making him an offer. When he couldn't pay the rent, his landlord offered to let him sell drugs in the trailer park. After he'd healed from his injury, he offered to teach him how to cook. His father cooked the product that he sold for his landlord, and by the time Gerald entered the 4th grade, his dad was hooked on a variety of substances. These drugs mixed well with his alcohol abuse, which was less of a fun party trick and more of a problem at home now. His mother was drinking as well, needing to cope with the prospects of living with Gerald's dad, and Gerald felt like he was the only sane person at home sometimes. 4th grade was the only year his dad started really hurting him. His dad had hurt him before. The more drugs he used and alcohol he drank, the angrier he seemed to become, but he was always careful about how he did it up until that point. Gone was the happy guy who used to toss the ball around with him or play Mario Kart on the old Super Nintendo in the living room. Gerald's dad was prone to fits of rage and sudden bouts of unexplainable anger, and it was usually targeted at Gerald or his mom. His mother tried to shield him from it more than once, but Gerald often found himself wearing long sleeves well into the hot months and pants year-round. So far, no one had seen the bruises or the burn marks or the casual clues of childhood trauma, but that would change one afternoon as he came home a little later than usual. It wasn't Gerald's fault he had been late. The bus had been running behind schedule, and Gerald had gotten home at 3:50 instead of 3:30. His dad had been waiting for him in the living room, and Gerald knew from the moment he saw him that he had been mad. He was sitting in his easy chair, his bloodshot eyes trained on the door, and when he called Gerald to him, his fingers had been digging furrows in the leather. "Where have you been?" his father growled, and Gerald could smell his rancid breath on his face. "The bus was late, Dad. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the floor, and his face felt like someone had hit it with a bat. "Don't you lie to me. I know you were out getting up to no good. Don't you dare lie to me. Don't you ever lie to me, boy. But then his mother had come running in, screaming bloody murder, as she saw what he had done. "Milton, for God's sake, you punched him in the face!" That explained a lot to Gerald at that moment. As his mother cradled his head, his father looking angry and worried as he glowered over him, Gerald felt like one of those computers that's been trying to load something, but just can't find it. In this case, the something was his ability to breathe and speak. He was struggling to figure out what had happened to him, and thankfully, his mom was content to repeat it a half a dozen times so his brain could catch up. His dad had socked him one. He had punched his ticket. He had clocked him and bent his gears. Gerald felt his world spinning drunkenly, and when he'd passed out, it had been a mercy. As he lay here now, listening to his mother sniffle from the living room and the TV blare out a western or a war movie, Gerald wished for oblivion now too. He wished, but apparently whatever force grants wishes for little kids in desperate situations had the night off, and he was left to shudder in his fear and cowardice a while longer. Sometimes I think Ridley really has lost his mind. Agent Tanner was cruising through the trailer park, his lights off and his speed low. This was not the place you wanted to cruise this time of night, and he knew it. Anyone looking out the windows at 3 a.m. would assume that he was looking for some place to buy drugs, and who could blame them? He was rolling along in a Chomo Special, a white panel van with no windows in the back, and the whole thing just screamed kidnap job. He would have rather posted up outside the court, pretending to be broken down, but Ridley had been very clear on what he wanted them to do. You'll know the kid when you find him, or more likely he'll find you. I have a sneaking suspicion that the kid we're looking for will be just as ready to leave his situation as you will be to help him." "Shh," Danver hissed, looking fretfully. "He'll hear you." Tanner scoffed. "His ears are pretty big, but I don't think he can hear me 7 states away. And so what if he does? It's no secret we all think he's a nut." I don't," Agent Merrill Danvers said quickly. "I think he's a genius, and we should all thank him for the hard work that he does." Tanner rolled his eyes as he took a curve at 5 miles an hour and passed down another long line of identical trailers. A snatch of song occurred to him, something his mother had sung when he was very young, and a place as different as this from night and day. He didn't remember much about that time, a time before being taken to the kindergarten, but the things he remembered often came back in short bursts when he least expected them. Case in point, he remembered vividly the whir of his little dump truck on the thick carpet of his house, and the click, click, click of his mother's sewing needles as she sang a song that encapsulated this place so well. "Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. There's a blue one, and a green one, and a pink one, and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they—" "Did you say something?" Agent Danvers said, and Tanner shook himself as he made another left turn. "Nothing," he whispered, looking at the houses as he rolled past, all of them looking much the same. "So, how do we know when we've found the right spot?" Danvers shrugged. "We don't, I guess. We just keep driving till we find him. We know he's here somewhere, so we just—" As the big double-wide came into view near the rear of the trailer court, Agent Tanner suddenly had a very new intuition that had nothing to do with the houses or ticky-tacky or anything. "I think, Danny boy, I might have a better idea." Gerald lay beneath the covers and listened to the snores coming from the living room. He couldn't be sure if it was a trap or not, but his mother had stopped crying, and that was a blessing. He looked at the floor of his bedroom and tried to find the string, seeing a pulsating orange line that extended into the hallway. Orange wasn't red. Orange was only slightly dangerous. But the pulsating made him think that time wasn't quite right yet. He yawned, not sure what time it was, but knowing it was early. He had dozed off for a little. He couldn't be sure how long. The old and battered Mickey Mouse alarm clock on the nightstand told him that it was about 3 a.m., but he wasn't entirely sure what time he had come back in through the hole in the floor. He rubbed a fist against his eyes, wincing as the pain moved through him. The first bruise was gone, but it hadn't been the last. The first one had been noticed by his teacher, Mrs. Castleberry. He had tried to hide it, not wanting his mother and father to get in trouble, but a black eye was harder to hide than bruises on your arms and legs. All his teachers knew that Gerald was not prone to fights and generally got along with his classmates. He had a way about him that often kept him away from bullies and gravitated him towards people who would be his friends. They also knew that Gerald's father had become mean as of late, refusing to help with class activities and generally being hostile to anyone who called the house to remind him of functions or parent-teacher nights. Many of them had suspected that his father had been abusing him for a few years now, and the size of that shiner that he now bore made them believe that he had finally taken it too far. When Mrs. Castleberry had asked him to stay after class, he'd been afraid that he'd done poorly on the last geography test he'd taken. It turned out it was much worse than that. "Gerald," she said, trying to be diplomatic, "I couldn't help but notice your injury. Are you feeling okay?" "Oh, this?" Gerald said, trying to laugh it off. It's nothing. I fell down the porch steps," he said, grasping for something that would sound believable. Mrs. Castleberry gave him a "we both know better than that" look, but proceeded on. "Oh my, well, I hope your parents took you to the hospital afterwards. Head wounds like that can have underlying effects on you as well." "Yes, ma'am," Gerald hedged. "Only they weren't home when I fell. I showed them when they got home, and since I wasn't feverish or dizzy, they said it was probably okay. Mom checked in on me throughout the night, and I guess I was just fine." "That's good," she said, though Gerald didn't think she really believed him. "Gerald, I think a great deal of you. A lot of your teachers think a lot of you, too. You're a joy to teach and a bright young man. Being as bright as you are, I know you know the difference between the truth and a lie." "Of course, Mrs. Castleberry," Gerald said, but I haven't lied to you. I really did." "Gerald, I can see the knuckle ridges under your left eyebrow. You can be honest with me. If your father is hurting you, then it needs to stop." Gerald had begun to feed her the same line a second time, but that's when he saw the string. Right around her stomach, looking for all the world like a weird intestine as it flowed from her, was a blue string. Gerald had learned to trust the strings more than he trusted people. He'd seen one attached to Kevin when he first met him, and knew they were meant to be best friends. He had seen one attached to Mr. Turner, and even though he hadn't known him, he would have surely failed the second grade if he hadn't trusted him. It wasn't that Gerald was dumb, not by any stretch, but he was distractible. The strings often kept him distracted, watching as they zoomed off in every direction, but Mr. Turner had helped him with that. "I had a similar problem when I was your age," he confided, though Gerald hadn't told him about the strings. "Everything was more interesting than school, and I had to find a way to clear my mind. When you feel like that, just close your eyes and breathe in deep, then push everything out and find your peace." That had helped, and Mr. Turner had helped him with other things too, and that had helped him get through the fractions and grammar and memorizing state capitals. Then there was Mrs. Castleberry, an adult that he had thought would just sail in and out of his life, until right this moment. She had the blue string, and that meant that she was important. He could feel the tears coming, and he didn't want them to. "It isn't his fault. He's been in a lot of pain since he fell off the truck." He told her the whole story, the abuse and all, and 1,000 excuses for his father besides. He made it pretty clear that he didn't blame his dad for any of this, and it must be the pain or his behavior, and not that his dad was a bad guy. He loved his dad, despite how he acted, and he remembered fondly the times they'd played catch or cars, or when he'd fixed his balsa wood glider with tape and they'd played airport in the backyard. He laid it all out, and when he was done, she said it would be okay and that she could fix it. He realized too late that the string was orange now, and that he had messed everything up. Mrs. Castleberry had called Child Protective Services, and that had been bad. They had called his parents to let them know that he was going into protective care, and that was worse. His dad had told him 100 times what happened to kids in CPS. Kids died there. Kids got worse than dead there, and Gerald knew that if he went, something bad would happen to him. They took him down to the Department of Children and Families in the big building downtown, the one you went to see the judge in. He sat in the same room as his parents and listened as Mrs. Castleberry told the CPS lady how she had noticed bruises as he tried so hard to hide them. She'd seen them, seen how he limped sometimes, but she had never had any solid proof. When I saw the bruise around his eye, however, I know that someone had finally gone too far. Then Mr. Turner had come in, and Gerald realized that everyone had known, despite how much he had tried to hide it. It wasn't as bad when he was in my class. His father's accident wouldn't occur until the 3rd grade, but I saw them over the years. Bruises on his arms were hard to miss, especially when I worked so closely with him. Sometimes he winced when he sat down, Sometimes he limped a little, though he tried to hide it, but mostly it was the way he craved praise. When his eyes lit up, you could tell there wasn't a lot of praise at home. Sometimes, and it broke my heart to see it, he would flinch away from me when I would lift a hand to pat his shoulder or his back. Someone had been hurting him, but I had hoped it wasn't his father. He idolized his father. It was pretty easy to tell, and the thought that his hero was giving them these injuries was horrific. They had turned to Gerald then, wanting him to tell them what had happened. Mrs. Castleberry had prepared him for this. He would have to tell them what his father had done. Then he could be removed from the situation. He had hoped that maybe she would take him in, but she had shaken her head sadly when he suggested it and told him she wasn't in a position to take in children right now. "My apartment isn't big enough for me most of the time. No, very likely they'll put you in a foster home for a while. With any luck, your mother will prove a better caregiver than your father, and you can go back to living with her." "Just long enough for someone to mess you up worse than I ever could," the voice of his father had said in his head. His father had assured him that foster homes would make the torture he received at home look like child's play. They would break his bones. They would burn him. They would touch him in places the TV shows said they shouldn't be touched, and everything in between. He wouldn't have his mother there to take the beatings for him, and he would suffer constantly. Gerald didn't care, though. If it would get his father taken away so he couldn't hurt his mother or him anymore, then it would be worth it. He got up, prepared to tell them what had happened, but one look at his father, and the words curdled in his throat. He was smiling, his face a mask of serenity, and his eyes held all the crazy light of a desert hermit. Those eyes promised Gerald that no matter what he did, he'd find him. He could live with a family in the North Pole, could live with a family on the moon, and he would still find him. He would drag him home. He would kill whatever family was hiding him, and he would hurt Gerald worse than he ever had. Looking at him now, Gerald found he couldn't tell the truth. Looking at his father as he sat quietly across from him, Gerald was forced to fall back on his comfortable lies. Worst of all was the blue string that now connected the two of them. The blue string that let him know that his dear old dad was still good for something. I don't know what they're talking about. I fell down the stairs. I hurt myself. I'm accident prone. Please don't take me away from my family. I want to go home. I want to go home. Please, just let me go home." As he said it, Gerald maintained eye contact with his father, begging him not to hold a grudge and let him come home. The CPS officer only shrugged, telling the two teachers that without a witness, there was no crime. Gerald went home with his parents in the end, and Mr. Turner and Mrs. Castleberry stood watching him go like a mirror of his own parents. They didn't look angry at Gerald, only sad and worried about the boy that they had almost freed. Gerald blinked hard, his eyes heavy, but if he fell asleep now, he might never wake up again. The string was working its way back to blue, but if he was going to catch it, then he needed to be ready. Something about the string made him think that today was the day that something good was going to happen, and if he missed it, then it might be his last opportunity. He had to trust in the string. It had gotten him this far, and he really had nothing else to trust in. His father had waited till the trailer door closed, and then began his evening torture. Gerald was subject to a beating like nothing he had ever seen before, and all of it was topped off by the constant stream of demoralization that flowed from his father. He could smell the acrid smell of cooking meth, the burning plastic of a roasted extension cord mixed with the pissy smell of overcooked bleach and his own blood in his nose. He suddenly knew the source of his father's rage. He had stopped long enough to look sane for the meeting with the CPS, but now he was looking forward to beating his son, who had dared to defy him, and cap it off by knocking his wife around and pulling that poison into his lungs and falling into a drug-induced euphoria. Gerald had passed out on the floor that night, waking up in his bed the next morning to be informed that he had been taken out of school. He was homeschooled now, and would be for as long as it took anyone to forget that bruise, or his name, or anything else about him. That had been the first time that Gerald had tried to escape, he reflected with a yawn, and as he drifted off again, he also reflected that it wasn't the last. The door to the manager's trailer had come open relatively easy for someone the feds suspected of being the tri-state area's major supplier of methamphetamines. Tanner had expected a gun in his face or a snarling dog, hell, even a chain lock, but the door had crashed open after only a single kick to reveal a very empty office. The trailer was mostly for show, he suspected, and Vernon Graff, the drug kingpin of the trailer court, was likely shacked up with whatever bad-skinned waif he could find his way into. With the product he was supposed to be pumping out, she might even have half her teeth if he was lucky. Tanner and his less-than-eager accomplice had fallen on the filing cabinets in the adjoining room like flies on dung. The trailer court wasn't huge, maybe 50 units, and though Mr. Graff was a decent drug manufacturer, his bookkeeping was subpar. His debt records, however, were on point, and Tanner soon had the information that he was looking for. There were about 20 kids in the trailer court, some families even having more than one. The place was mostly for guys who worked at the steel mill or the paper mill, and the number of families here was surprisingly low. Of those 20 kiddos, about 12 of them were boys, the gender Ridley had designated. Of the 12, 4 were in high school, which put them right out, and 3 weren't in school at all, which also put them out. That left just 5 kiddos to go through. Not bad odds, all things considered. We can start with the Neely house. It's 2 rows over, and Tanner began, before he was so rudely interrupted by the loud caw of an angry drunk. "What the hell is this?" came a voice from the front, presumably Vernon, after staggering in from whatever trailer he had been entertaining the night before. A quick look at his watch showed Tanner that it was nearly 5 a.m., and the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon just a little bit. They'd taken too long, even with Danvers' trained eye for info, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. He flicked his head at Danvers, telling him to get beside the door, and as Tanner drew his Glock and made ready, he felt that same stab of exhilaration shoot through him that always preceded violence. Maybe he'd have to hurt the guy, maybe even kill him. Danvers looked unsure as he held up his Sig Sauer in a shaking hand, but Tanner was cool as a cucumber. This was the work that he enjoyed. "When I catch you miserable sons of bitches, I swear to God I'll string you up in the yard. Is that you, Trevor? You coked up little slag? I swear to God, if you're trying to rob me, I'll bruise your face up so bad that none of your bears will want to..." He pushed the thin little door harder than he strictly needed to, and came into the office like a charging water buffalo. The door crashed into Danvers, the little man making a sound before bumping into the wall, and when Vernon Graff turned to see what it had been, Tanner hit him with the butt of his gun on the back of the head. A few minutes later, Vernon had an even ruder awakening as someone threw vodka in his face from a nearby mini-fridge. By then, he was tied into his office chair with extension cords, and the sun was less of an idea and more of a promise for the near future. Tanner wasn't a little guy, but it had taken him and Danvers both to get the bulk of the meth-dealing landlord into his chair. The vodka, he was hoping, would sting his eyes and make him less likely to ID the two, though that really didn't matter. When you worked for the Blacksite, your records looked like someone had gotten a little goofy with a black marker anyway. "Good morning, Mr. Graff," Danvers said, using his calm and delicate accountant's voice. "This won't take long. We just need to ask you a few Vernon Graff spat a lot of spittle and foul-smelling vodka into his face, and Danvers' next words were lost amongst a lot of coughing and huffing. "Screw you! You ain't got nothing! I ain't got nothing for you stupid druggos here! Get the hell out! Right now! Before I—" But his bluster was lost as the cold nose of Tanner's Glock found the thick and arthritis-kissed left knee that Vernon was bouncing without realizing it. The bouncing stopped as he spoke. "Looks like civility's off the table, Danny boy. Now then, Vern, either you answer my questions, or you will have to learn to chase trailer park jailbait and cook your poison with only one working knee. Do we have an understanding?" Vernon opened his broken-toothed maw, likely to deliver something angry and stupid that would leave him with a bullet wound, but he closed his lips around it and nodded instead. Well, Tanner thought, he'd be dipped. You can teach an old dog new tricks. "We're looking for a kid, about 10 or 11, who might possess some weird abilities. Nothing too weird. Maybe he moves stuff around. Maybe he guesses a little too well. Maybe he avoids you like the plague because he knows you're thinking about taking more than his lunch money." Vernon bristled again, but the cold nose of the gun doused his anger a bit. "Either way, we want him. We'll find him. The question is, are the cops going to find you with a sock in your mouth and tape holding it in, or a nice fat bullet hole in your skull? Either way, they'll never catch us. We're ghosts, Vern, and we don't catch easy." "I don't know nobody like that," Vern answered, too hastily, Tanner thought. "Think real hard, Vern," he said, taking the gun off his knee and putting it up against the fat waddle of his neck that covered his chin. "Think really hard, 'cause there's a 1911 in your desk drawer over there, and a 9mm slug is a 9mm slug, especially when the weapon's in your hand and the suicide note is so convincing." The gun shook, but it had nothing to do with Tanner's grip. "I don't know," Vern begged, beginning to cry big, greasy tears. "I don't know anyone like that. Kids around here are half inbred. They barely pass high school, let alone have weird powers. The McCluskey brat has a web foot. Forrester girl has a lazy eye. The Nemo brat has a colostomy bag 'cause his shitter doesn't work right. Is that what you're after? None of them are special, but you can take all of them. Only don't kill me. I don't want to..." He paused as Tanner reached up and pulled the slide back, ejecting a bullet which he caught and palmed. 10 seconds, Vernon. We can find him without you, but why not make it easy?" "I don't know," he wailed, afraid to move too much. The sound of a drawer opening roughly made him shudder. 9. "Brad Neary's kid has an eye for ball pitches," Vernon shuddered out. The cold barrel of the Glock went away, but it was replaced with the familiar barrel of the 1911. 8, Tanner intoned. The Glibson girl has a mouth like a Hoover," he practically squealed. 7, Tanner called, working the slide and checking for ammo. Just his luck, a full clip. 6, he said, Vernon reduced to blubbering by this point. 5, 4, 3, "Gerald Worley!" he screeched, holding his hands up as much as he could to stop the counting. "Couldn't hear that," Tanner said, wedging the gun into his wattles. "Want to try again?" "Gerald Worley," Vernon panted. "Milton Worley's kid. I've watched him follow weird paths like my grandma used to do with a divining rod when I was little. She was looking for water, but I don't know what this kid's looking for. Sometimes he seems to follow stuff only he can see, And one time, I saw him follow it to a grate where he found $1 in time for the ice cream truck to roll by. I asked him once what he was doing, and he said he was following the strings. I don't know what that means, but it was so weird that it stuck with me, you know?" Tanner took the gun away, nodding as he thought about it. Gerald could see the ways that fate might take. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Graff," Tanner said, hitting him with the butt of his own gun hard enough to crack his skull. Vernon Graff wouldn't die, not that day, but he would spend a few days in the hospital after his secretary came in to find him unconscious and bleeding on the carpet a half hour later. Tanner's prints wouldn't be found anywhere, and the whole thing would be chalked up to a robbery. Vernon would be very vocal about how they had been the ones to abduct Gerald Worley, probably hoping for a reward of some kind. Whether they believed him or not, Gerald would be long gone by then. Gerald snorted awake, cursing himself for falling asleep. The blue string was probably throbbing now, and as he got out of bed, he was through the hole and under the skirting in a heartbeat. He had his bag, his meager possessions, and a thick blue string to guide him. This was it. This was his destiny. He was going to make it out of here. The string led into the road, and that's how the white panel van came to be in his path, just in time for him to run smack dab into it. The only two more surprised than Gerald were Agents Danver and Agent Tanner. They had quite literally run smack into the boy that they were looking for, and the hit had been hard enough to knock him out cold. Gerald would come awake in a very different bed, surrounded by strangers, to the sound of a little girl crying. Gerald was the last student of this year's kindergarten class, and school was about to be in session. It was the strangest thing, but this is definitely the kid that Graff was talking about. Security Chief Ridley smiled, the effect enough to make his old students' blood run cold when they had reason to see it. You'd be surprised how many times things like this happen in our line of work. He was thinking about another potential kindergarten alumni who was coming in with his dropout mother. The two finally reunited after so long. These coincidences were normal for people in their line of work. "Even so," Danvers said, trying to make the conversation sound normal, but letting his trepidation slip through, "I'd wager that not many other snatch squads have the targets run into their transport and knock themselves out." Ridley nodded. That one was different. He let the silence slip by, knowing it would make Danver uncomfortable and wanting to hear him squirm a little. Charles Danver had been a squirmy little maggot when he had taken up residence at the site, a small child who had been hard to break of pissing his pants and stuttering ceaselessly. His parents had been more than happy to get rid of him, and Ridley had been happy to take him in. For a worm, he spoke like a king when he needed to, and he was a whiz with numbers. Even so, Ridley liked to listen to him squirm. "So, anyway, we should be back at the site in 48 hours. We have enough drugs to keep him under, and his head injury looks superficial at best." "For your sake, Danny boy, I hope so. If that kid dies of a brain bleed, then you can be my newest student in the kindergarten. Imagine how silly you'll look, trying to fit in with the kids, barely in middle school." Danver laughed, but there was no humor behind it. "Till then," Ridley said, and hung up on him before he could respond. Looking at the roster on his computer, he ticked another box and smiled as a result. Of the 25 potential students, they had received 20. That was pretty good. 80% was well within parameters, but he had conducted class with less. By the end, there would be less anyway, and that too was expected and acceptable. He would burn them out, they would take their own lives, some might even kill each other. This was expected and acceptable. "This year's class will be most interesting," Ridley said. the lights of the screen turning his glasses into a glare-blind window. He had no idea how prophetic those words would be. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's video. If you still feel like you could do with a little more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that's appearing on your screen? If you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss any of the stories we put on here. I make new videos 7 days a week, and I wouldn't want you to miss a one of them. So if you'd like to support the channel, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the great stuff we do here. And of course, if you'd like to support the channel in a more financial way, you could always become a member on YouTube or on Patreon. Spooky Skeletons, that's my $5 members, always get their videos early, as opposed to in the evening. And we've got lots of other cool stuff that you can take advantage of. Just go down to Patreon and give it a look, or become a member on YouTube. Speaking of all of our wonderful patrons and YouTube members, let's go ahead and thank them right now. Thanks to Unicorn Hollow, our Spooky Ghost contributor. Thanks to our Spooky Skeleton contributors, Janice, Lee Kendall, and Saikat. Thanks to our Ghostly Reader contributors, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, and Sarah SAMR42. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. Again, if you'd like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, there are links below to Patreon, and you can just go to YouTube and click on membership, if that's something that interests you. There's also links to my latest book below if you'd like to go have a look on Amazon. It should show you the other books I've got as well, so why not go ahead and get the whole collection. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.